Have you ever been stripped of your right to speak? In the very room where your voice once saved everyone inside? Pushed to the sidelines, forced to watch as others decide the fate of the child you poured your youth and every drop of sweat into raising? It doesn't feel like a punch. It feels like a cold hand quietly closing the door right in your face and locking it with a smile. Maya Sinclair knew that feeling all too well. She had gone from cramped, dingy rooms smelling of ink and mildew to the CEO's chair on the 50th floor of a gleaming glass tower. She had taken a gasping, failing company and turned it into a billion-dollar empire. But that morning, in a long, carpeted hallway, she was stopped. A single sheet of paper declared, "You no longer have voting rights on today's deal." No one met her eyes. Only thin laughs. Handshakes passed right over her head as if she had never existed. What they didn't know was that Maya wasn't here to beg for her seat back. She came for something far more important, the truth. And once she had it, the whole board would flip. Because Maya's ambition was never just to keep the CEO's title. She wanted to protect the soul of the company, something no spreadsheet or contract could ever measure. She wanted every person who had bowed to hollow power to understand. True power doesn't shout. It waits. It watches. And when the time comes, it only needs one move. That day, they thought they had taken Maya Sinclair off the board. What they didn't realize was that they had just helped her place the final piece for checkmate. Before I tell you the full story, and the twist that left an entire courtroom frozen, if you believe justice never truly belongs to the stronger side, hit like, share, and subscribe so more people can hear this story. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next one tomorrow. Now, let's go back to that morning, to where it all began, with the first door that was locked. That morning, the city still lay half asleep beneath a thin veil of fog, but the glass tower of Sinclair Capital blazed like a lighthouse. Maya Sinclair stepped out of a sleek black car, neither hurried nor slow. The silver-gray suit hugged her slender yet resilient frame, catching the warm light from the lobby and turning her into a silhouette both cold and elusive. Each step on the marble floor landed with steady precision, like the tick of an antique clock, measuring the tension in the air before it even broke. She had walked into this building thousands of times, yet never had it felt this cold. Not the air conditioning kind of cold, but the chill of an invisible distance. The receptionist glanced up, offered polite smiles, then dropped their eyes back to their screens, as if her presence was nothing more than a passing shadow. Her gaze drifted down the carpeted hall, and memories of her early days came rushing back. Back when her office was a room leased from a bankrupt company, with the smell of old printer paper mingling with the dampness from a leaking ceiling. She had worked through the night drafting contracts, then met clients in the morning wearing a discount rack suit. Once, she'd waited nearly 4 hours in a cramped reception area, downing 3 cups of instant coffee, just to land a contract worth under $10,000. Now, everything was different. She was the woman who had taken a gasping company and built it into a billion-dollar empire. But what people would remember today wasn't that journey. What they were about to remember was the scene that would unfold in just a few minutes. The 50th floor hallway was both opulent and icy. The hiss of the coffee machine in the pantry, the faint aroma of freshly ground beans, the rapid clack of keyboards in the distance, and the sharp steps of high heels, all of it blended into the perfect soundtrack for another workday. But to Maya, it was the overture to a stage already set. She just didn't know if she was walking in as the lead or as an uninvited spectator. Straightening her collar, she strode toward the boardroom. The double walnut doors with gold-plated handles stood like a fortress gate. Beyond them, she knew, were familiar faces. The same people who had shaken her hand when the company won its first big deal. The same ones who had toasted her when the stock hit record highs. But this morning, they might as well have been in another world. And she was about to be left outside. One deep breath, a hand lifting to push the door. Maya didn't know, or rather she knew all too well, that one more step would start the game. And what waited on the other side wasn't a meeting. Her hand had just touched the handle when a voice spoke, soft but firm enough to stop her. "Miss Sinclair, a moment, please." The board's legal aide stood there, black suit sharp, a slim folder tucked under his arm. His face was expressionless, like a man performing airport security. He handed her a single sheet of paper, neatly sealed in a plastic sleeve as though this had been prepared long ago. "This is the official notice. The board has decided to suspend your voting rights for today's deal." The words landed crisp, each syllable enunciated. No pause for her to ask why. Maya looked down. Bold letters in the center read, "Voting rights suspended." Beneath it, the reason, just 3 words, "Conflict of interest." Words delivered as casually as a good morning, smooth, detached, with no expectation of reply. She looked up, her eyes scanning the polished, impassive face before her. A single moment of silence long enough to unsettle him, not long enough to spark confrontation. She nodded once, took the paper. From behind the walnut doors came laughter. The delicate chime of glass meeting glass, pure, self-satisfied, as if the people inside were already celebrating victory before the game began. She caught the deep, familiar voice of a board member who once promised to always have her back. In her hand, the paper weighed almost nothing. In her chest, a stone. Not because she'd lost her vote, but because of how they had done it. Quick, clinical, and without bothering to hide their glee. "I understand, thank you," Maya said quietly. Loud enough only for him. He dipped his head slightly like a gatekeeper who had completed his duty. No apology, no explanation. In this game, no one felt the need to apologize for removing someone. Maya stood still, eyes fixed on the closed doors. If she pressed her ear against them, she might catch every word. But she didn't need to. She'd sat in that chair. She'd been the one to raise the glass. She knew exactly what they were saying, and more importantly, what they were thinking. They believed today was the day they cut her influence from the company. Funny. They didn't know that in chess, sometimes you hold back the queen. To strike on the final move. She turned, walking toward the back row of seats. Each step was a reminder to herself. The game wasn't over and she hadn't lost. In a few minutes, those laughs would fall silent. Maya took a seat in the last row, where sunlight from the window barely brushed the edge of her chair, leaving half her face in shadow. The voting rights suspended notice rested neatly in her hands, so thin she could crush it with a flick of her fingers. But she kept it flat, like a ticket to a performance she'd been waiting for. One event organizer glanced her way, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Maya answered with a thin smile, polite enough not to be provocative, sharp enough to make him look away instantly. Inside, a quiet thought surfaced. Interesting. They think a locked door is enough to keep me out. Across the room, the meeting began. The board chair, in a dark blue suit, spoke in the even cadence of someone reading a business report. From the snippets she caught, Maya could tell they were framing the merger as a historic victory. No one mentioned her. They didn't need to. Removing her had been handled before the meeting even started. She leaned back, narrowing her eyes. There was no hint of defeat there, only calculation. People often assumed being stopped meant being taken out of the game, but Maya knew this game didn't play out entirely inside that room. Some of its most decisive moves happened in the hallway outside. The chime of glasses again. She didn't need to look to know someone had just smiled in triumph, toasting to a turning point for the company. The amusing part was that they thought she couldn't hear. Worse, they thought she was too far to understand. Maya tilted her head slightly as if enjoying a familiar song. But in truth, she was listening for every breath and every pause in the conversation. Those pauses mattered more than the words. They were where the cracks appeared. And cracks were where she would slip in. A passing server's tray shook slightly as his eyes caught hers, surprise flashing at seeing the CEO seated apart like an audience member. Maya only smiled, nodding lightly. Then her gaze returned to the closed doors, the ceiling lights catching in her deep, unyielding eyes. If there had been a camera, it would have stopped here, on eyes that had not surrendered, had not wavered, but were waiting for the right moment to move. She knew one truth. What makes a blow truly devastating isn't its force, it's its timing. And when that moment came, no door would be strong enough to keep her out. When it did, they'd wish they had never stopped her. Maya chose a seat in the last row where the view stretched wide like an audience watching a play. From here, she could see every face around the long conference table. The perfectly tailored suits, the meticulously practiced smiles, and the eyes that managed to be both friendly and calculating, like the two sides of a coin. The room was designed to impress: high ceilings, gleaming wood-paneled walls, ivory drapes falling in soft folds, and the warm yellow glow spilling from crystal chandeliers suspended above. On the table, rows of mineral water bottles were lined up with precision, each glass holding a thin slice of lemon like a sliver of light caught through glass. Everything was arranged as a testament that this was a place of major decisions, a place where nothing was left to chance. But in Maya's heart, it was all just a shade of ashen gray. The color of smoke after the fire has died out, of embers after passion has been doused by a cold, deliberate hand. She felt no warmth in the luxury, no awe at the grandeur, only an alert kind of emptiness, like someone stepping out of a cold rain, knowing they should change into something dry, but choosing instead to linger and feel the chill. From her vantage point, each board member was simply playing their role. Some leaned back to listen, others scribbled notes, while a few sat with hands clasped as if their words might decide the company's future. Maya knew every one of them, who had climbed up because of the opportunities she had created, who had stood by her when the company nearly collapsed, and who had always waited in the middle, ready to cross to whichever side won. She felt her heartbeat slow, her breathing steady, as if preparing for an important presentation. Except today she had no part to present. They had taken that from her before the meeting even began. Still, Maya didn't feel entirely shut out. She was still in the room, still seeing, still hearing. Sometimes, not having a seat at the table was an advantage. You could see the whole picture, not just the slice in front of you. A younger, newer member on the far left glanced at her quickly before turning away the moment their eyes met. Maya held his gaze for just a heartbeat longer, enough for him to understand she knew more than she said. In the quiet between the shuffle of chairs and the rustle of paper, Maya sensed something waiting to reveal itself. Not just a deal, a message. And that message, whether they wanted it or not, would find its way to everyone. She knew there would come a moment when someone in this room would wish they had not taken their seat today. The chairman, a man with neatly kept silver hair and sharp, cold eyes, sat at the head of the table like a captain preparing to set sail. His voice rang out slowly, but with barely contained excitement, each word pressed with the weight of good news delivered to the entire room. He spoke of a strategic leap forward, of opening a new era, of a deal bringing value beyond the numbers. Every sentence curved perfectly, polished so smooth there wasn't an extra word, not a single gap to pry open. People nodded, smacked their lips, and wore the well-rehearsed expressions of agreement. Maya sat still, eyes fixed on every movement. She realized they weren't announcing a deal. They were engraving a story into the room's memory, that this was their victory, not hers. When the chairman paused to sip his water, a male director seated mid-table turned toward her. His smile was deliberate, not to be friendly, but to display dominance. "Shame," he said, voice just loud enough for a few nearby to hear, "that the one who took this ship out to sea doesn't get to touch the wheel." A few heads turned, as if to confirm they'd heard correctly. Then came scattered laughter, even a few light claps, the kind of harmless sound that cut sharper than an insult. Maya's face didn't change. No frown, no glance away. She simply looked straight at him, not harsh, but long enough to make his smile falter, flickering like a lamp about to go out. He turned back to the table, but Maya knew his words weren't just for her. They were for everyone watching, a reminder that power had shifted. The laughter still lingered as the chairman resumed speaking, as if nothing had happened. Maya leaned back, scanning the faces around her. Some pretended they hadn't heard, some smiled thinly, and others bent to their notes as if recording the moment. In her mind, one thought crystallized, not to fire back immediately, but to etch into memory. they truly believe that changing the hand on the wheel means they can steer the ship. But they've forgotten. I'm the one who drew the map. She let her silence stretch into an uncomfortable gap between the laughter. A gap someone eventually would try to fill. And when they did, she would know exactly where to strike. Because sometimes it isn't the ship that decides the destination. It's the one who knows how to keep wind in the sails. Maya's gaze never left the man who had thrown the barb. The distance between them was only a few rows, but her eyes made it feel like he was under a light he couldn't hide from. No anger, no outburst, just quiet observation, long enough to make every movement of his hands awkward. He tried to focus on the document in front of him, but his hand trembled slightly as he turned the page. Maya noticed and filed it away. Overconfident people rarely endure silence well, especially when that silence comes from the person they think they've removed from the board. Her eyes swept the entire table, pausing for a beat on each face. They thought she was clinging to dignity. In reality, she was measuring distance, counting breaths, and marking every weak link in the chain of power they had just assembled. Amid the soft rustle of papers and the chairman's steady voice, a map began to take shape in her mind. Not of the merger, but of a counterstrike. One that required no loud objection, no public clash. Only moments like this, when they were most confident and she was most silent. Outside the window, the midday sun spilled over the city, glinting off glass towers. It reminded her of another morning, years ago, when a potential client had laughed at her proposal and walked away. 2 months later, that same person returned, asking to sign a contract. On her terms. History, she knew, was always willing to repeat itself for those patient enough to wait. A young board member in the corner table stole an unconscious glance her way, his eyes holding a trace of apology he didn't dare voice. Maya answered with a faint nod, then turned her gaze back to the man who had laughed. He tried to chat with the person next to him, but his voice had dropped, stripped of the confidence he'd worn moments earlier. She knew from this moment on he'd feel her eyes even when she wasn't looking. That's the power of well-timed silence. It follows like a shadow, making them wonder what you're thinking and what you'll do next. And the truth was, Maya was thinking plenty. She had no intention of just sitting here and enduring more jabs. Every word they spoke, every shift in expression, every pause was becoming data for her next move. The only question now wasn't if she would strike back, but whether they could stand when she did. The vice president's office sat in the corner of the floor, 3 glass walls opening to a full sweep of the city skyline. Afternoon light poured down onto the streets, coating the distant buildings with a thin glaze of gold. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft exhale of the air conditioning. Maya pushed the door open, her steps slow, as if granting the man inside a moment to prepare. He, someone she had once lifted from obscurity to a place of influence, looked up with a polite smile. On his desk, a white porcelain coffee cup still steamed, its warmth blending with the sweet scent of vanilla. But for Maya, that vanilla couldn't mask another scent. One she recognized instantly, though it was hard to name. The scent of betrayal hanging in the space between them. The office had the polish of someone newly accustomed to success. Bookshelves lined with hardcovers that may never have been opened. An abstract painting hung directly opposite the desk, and decorative pieces meant only to say their owner had taste. But Maya remembered his first office clearly, a disused meeting room, damp-smelling, with a battered table sheet had polished just enough to make it presentable for clients. Now everything was new, and much of that newness was because of her. He invited her to sit, his tone warm enough to recall the years they had steered the company together, but measured enough to remind her that the balance of power had shifted. Maya didn't answer right away. She chose a seat opposite him, tilting slightly so the light from the glass wall fell across half her face. She wanted to observe, not just listen. On the desk, besides the coffee cup, lay a slim file slightly off to the right. A quick glance was enough. She didn't need to read past the company logo and opening lines to know what it contained. The formal report on the reasons for suspending her voting rights. He didn't rush to the point. Instead, he asked a few surface-level questions about her recent projects, about business trips the press had covered. Every question was proper, but Maya knew they were just the foam before the coffee was stirred. She replied briefly, politely, but with her guard now fully visible in her eyes. In that glass-walled room, with the sun starting to retreat from the tops of the buildings, Maya realized this conversation would be unlike any they'd had before. And the vanilla scent was starting to crowd out everything else, as if masking whatever she was about to hear. She just didn't know if those words would come like a blade to the heart or a handshake to the door. Finally, he set down his cup, fingers interlacing on the desk. His eyes met hers, no longer the gaze of a man who remembered a debt, but of someone who believed he sat higher now, with no reason left to pretend humility. "This morning," he began, "I think you should know, I voted in favor of suspending your rights." The words came as lightly as a weather update. No hesitation, no detour, and certainly no remorse. Maya didn't move, didn't nod or shake her head. She only leaned forward slightly as if to hear him more clearly. The company, he went on, needs a new vision, a direction not clouded by emotion. Each word fell with calculated precision like stones dropped into a still lake. Not enough to create waves, but enough to distort the surface. Maya thought of the countless times her so-called emotion had saved this company from disastrous deals. How it had made her refuse to sell equity to a conglomerate that only wanted to strip the brand. How it had kept hundreds of jobs in a round of cuts the board had called unavoidable. And now that very thing was the reason given to push her out. Afternoon light angled through the glass, catching on his face, highlighting the thin smile at the corner of his lips. Not the smile of joy, but of someone who believed they had just won a difficult game. "You understand, don't you?" he asked, his tone almost gentle, as if offering her a chance to agree to leave quietly. Maya tilted her head. "I understand," she said, voice low and steady. "I've just always been curious. What people who are certain they're above emotion do when they realize they've been wrong?" The question floated between them, as light as the steam curling from his cup, but sharp enough to cut through the balance he thought he held. His lips pressed together, eyes shifting, just for a moment, but enough for Maya to catch it. She leaned back, letting the light fall directly into her eyes, unblinking. In her mind, the pieces of a countermove began to click together, each repetition of his new vision becoming fuel for the fire they thought had burned out. And then she realized betrayers often forget one thing. The person they stab in the back can still turn around and bring the blade with them. Maya didn't shift her posture. She stayed still, hands resting loosely on the chair's arms, gaze fixed on him. For a few seconds, the space between them stretched, not in feet or inches, but in worlds. One made of numbers, reports, and ambition, wrapped in cold rationality. The other built from memory, people, and everything that made the work more than just a transaction. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but clear. Emotion is the only thing that makes a human different from a machine. No raised tone, no theatrical emphasis, yet each word landed like a truth that couldn't be denied. He blinked, as if hearing something for which he had no ready answer, because to deny it would be to admit he'd turned himself into something unfeeling. To agree would collapse the argument he had just made. Maya rose. Her movements were unhurried, not like someone pushed out of the game, but like an actor leaving the stage at the exact peak of tension, forcing the audience to sit and think about the last line they had heard. Her hand touched the doorknob, and she felt the weight of the silence behind her. Not the quiet of a well-insulated glass office, but the silence of someone searching for a reply and finding none. The door closed softly, leaving him alone with his cooling coffee and a sentence that would gnaw at him the longer he thought about it. Maya stepped into the hallway, the day's last light spilling across the long gray carpet like a road no one had yet walked. She didn't need to look back to know he was still sitting there, maybe staring into space, maybe burying himself in the file as if the pages might give him back the ground she'd just taken. But Maya knew the answer wasn't in the text. It was in the question he'd now have to ask himself. Was removing her truly a victory, or just the first move toward something bigger? and far more dangerous. Maya had never called herself patient, but in games like this, she knew the value of waiting for the right moment. Every word, every glance, every step out of that room was part of the next move. And in her mind, the shape of that move was already clear. Not to reclaim the seat for its own sake, but to make sure that anyone who thought they could push her out would one day have to open the door themselves and invite her back in. She allowed herself the smallest inward smile because when that day came, no one in that boardroom would keep their seat. The next morning, the city woke to her name everywhere, not in financial headlines or business strategy columns, but splashed across tabloid covers and clickbait sites that thrived on the cheapest kind of curiosity. Maya Sinclair, CEO losing her grip? The headline appeared again and again, plastered like posters for a performance she had never agreed to give. The chosen photos were calculated, cruel. One caught her leaving the building the day before, afternoon light casting long shadows over her face. Another showed her seated at the back of the boardroom, head slightly lowered, eyes distant. In reality, it had been a single moment of reflection. But in the cropped and curated lens, it became the portrait of a woman exhausted, diminished, perhaps even defeated. The articles didn't openly accuse her of anything. Instead, the language was arranged with surgical precision to make readers reach their own conclusions. Sources close to the matter. Names never given. Certain board members are concerned. Quotes never direct. Each sentence was a half-truth, designed to stay just within the lines of legality while sketching a picture of a leader losing control. Maya sat at the kitchen table, steam curling from her black tea. She flipped through the stack of printed headlines her assistant had delivered, her gaze lingering on each photo. Not out of anger. Rage would be exactly what they wanted. But to commit each word, each framing, each cut of the image to memory. All evidence of an orchestrated campaign. Morning light streamed in through the window, laying a thin wash of gold across the wooden table. Outside, traffic swelled and wind slid between the buildings. Maya took a sip, the bitterness spreading across her tongue. It wasn't the bitterness of failure, and it was the taste of challenge, of warning, a signal that the game had entered a new round. Online, the comments split into two clear camps. One attacked, swallowing the narrative whole. The other defended, citing her track record and resilience. But Maya knew that in an information war, truth didn't always win. The victor was whoever controlled the story. She set the final paper down, her expression nothing like the disoriented figure they hoped to see. If this was the media dagger they planned to bury in her back, they had forgotten something. Blades cut both ways, and the one holding the hilt decides the final strike. And Maya already knew that when she struck back, the sound would drown out every headline they'd ever printed. The morning's noise had barely begun to fade when her phone started vibrating nonstop. A text from finance. 2 major investors just announced a pause in disbursements. An email from HR. Several senior managers requesting indefinite postponement of meetings. No one said it outright, but Maya understood. They were signaling distance. The silence of former allies can weigh more than the shouts of enemies. She had seen this before in business. When a ship began to rock, people leapt for another before it sank, no matter who had rowed them here. By afternoon, fresh news leaked from a credible source. The board had signed a contract with a crisis management PR firm. Their assignment wasn't to protect the company's image. It was to fan the flames of Maya Sinclair is unstable, volatile, until her position collapsed entirely. Their equation was simple. Destroy her reputation and shareholders would lose faith. Then they could remove her without a noisy vote. In her office, Maya stood before the glass wall looking down at the city. The streets below were jammed with cars, a current no one could reverse. She knew she was in a war where the bullets weren't led, but words, images, and nods exchanged in rooms where she wasn't present. The irony was almost laughable. The board was repeating a classic mistake, thinking noise could drown someone who had learned to live in the storm. She had faced the press when bankruptcy rumors swirled, when a major deal collapsed at the last minute, when a product was labeled dead on arrival before launch. Each time she hadn't just survived, she'd returned stronger, leaving opponents wondering how. Her phone buzzed again. An anonymous text, 2 sentences only. "They'll release a fake interview next week. It'll make you look unhinged." Maya read it, set the phone down without surprise. She didn't need to know who sent it. The only thing that mattered was that the other side was already imagining their win. On her desk, neatly stacked beside her laptop, sat a file. Evidence she'd been collecting for months. Not time to use it yet. But its presence reminded her this fight wasn't about defense alone. She turned her chair, leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the stillness between waves. She knew in media, as at sea, sometimes all it took was waiting for the right moment to turn the whole ship. And when this one turned, no one on deck would stay standing. From morning till noon, her phone rang endlessly. Each call from an unfamiliar number, each voice sharpened with the same question. "Miss Sinclair, your response to the board's claim that do you have a comment on, is it true you're losing operational control?" She answered none of them. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood the rule. Speak too soon, and you let the other side set the frame. In media, silence wasn't always weakness. Sometimes it was bait, forcing the opponent to overreach, to overstate, to show the seams they thought invisible. Instead of reacting, she opened her laptop and typed a short email to her attorney. Just 8 words. "File suit immediately. Urgent. Call me when done." No greeting, no context. The recipient would know exactly what to do, and do it fast. She hadn't chosen him for courtroom theatrics, but for his precision in striking first. While others were still arguing in headlines, he'd be placing a legal document in front of a judge. She hit send, closed the laptop. For a moment, the room was so still she could hear the clock ticking each second. The feeling that came wasn't nerves, but the calm of someone who had learned to move in deep waters where few dared to swim. Outside the window, the city roared. But in the storyteller's mind, the scene shifted to a chessboard. Black and white pieces moved not just by rule, but with faces. The board members, investors, shadowy figures pulling media strings. In one corner, the Black Queen sat motionless, leaning slightly as if waiting. From across the board, the opponent saw her as blocked, with no move left. But Maya, in her silence, knew the truth. The next move would change the entire game. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't answer. She poured more tea instead, letting the call fade. Every action now carried meaning, even doing nothing. She knew the days ahead would be brutal. More articles, more inside sources, more whispers designed to test her patience. But to her, each strike was just another piece being pushed into the place she wanted it. And when the final move came, they would learn like this board had never been theirs. The law office sat high in an old building, its dark wood-paneled walls giving off a weight of history, while the cold white lighting stripped away any sense of warmth. This was not a space designed for comfort. It was built to remind clients that, from this point forward, everything was pure business. And here, business meant war. On the long wooden table, stacks of documents rose in neat, deliberate order, each stack clipped with a short, blunt label. Evidence, correspondence, shareholder contracts, meeting minutes. Not a single page was ornamental. Not a single page was without purpose. Maya sat at the head of the table, fingers laced, eyes tracking the papers as they slid toward her. She said nothing, letting her lawyer, a stocky man with streaks of silver in his hair and a voice sharp enough to cut, lead the meeting. "We'll file for an injunction to halt the merger on grounds of shareholder clause violations," he said, flipping to the next page without looking down. "At the same time, we'll issue a request for full document production from the board. Any delay on their part will be treated as obstruction." His tone was devoid of emotion, but every word carried the precision of a blade, mapping the lines of attack. Maya remained silent, not out of confusion, but because she wanted the entire picture before speaking. In legal combat, the impatient player always exposed their weaknesses first. Overhead, the white light reflected off the polished table, turning the papers into a chessboard of shining squares. Every document, every clause was a piece in play, and Maya knew each move had to be calculated all the way to the endgame. "There's one problem," the lawyer said, pausing. "They'll try to stall this process. They know that if they drag it out, the media pressure will grind away at your credibility." Maya nodded slightly as if this was just one more tile in a mosaic she'd already seen. She had no intention of letting the press dictate the narrative. Another paper slid her way, an emergency motion to the court. Maya read it, stopped at a few key lines, then pushed it back. "Do it now," she said, her voice quiet but steel-edged. Outside, the sky had gone gray, clouds pulling tight like curtains over the light. The air inside felt like the moment before a downpour, still, compressed, but brimming with energy waiting to break. And in that silence, she knew. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was the first move in a reversal. And when the board was set, there would be no retreat for them. News of Maya's lawsuit spread fast, and the board's response was just as quick. They didn't act shocked or shaken. Within 2 days, they had announced their own legal team, a powerhouse firm the media called the ones who never lose. One headline spelled it out: Maya Sinclair versus the steel wall of law. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, the courthouse hallway was jammed with reporters. Camera flashes exploded in rapid fire as voices ricocheted off the marble walls. "Do you believe you'll win? What's your opinion of their team? Is this a desperate attempt to hold power?" Maya walked past without stopping, the click of her heels steady as a metronome, eyes locked on the heavy wooden doors ahead. Inside, the air was thick. Across from her, the board's attorneys sat in a row, each with a thick folder open, pens poised. The lead counsel, a tall man with a resonant, polished voice, opened by questioning Maya's true motives. They didn't just counter, they cut in. Each time her lawyer began a point, a hand would shoot up from their side, a voice slicing through. "Objection. Irrelevant. Clarify the source." The strategy was obvious. Fracture her narrative. Make her case sound disjointed. Give the impression she had no firm ground. At one point, a young attorney on their side stood, smirking before saying, "We see no evidence the board breached any shareholder agreements. This is purely an emotional reaction to a collective decision." The phrase emotional reaction rang out clearly, and a few heads turned toward Maya, searching for any flicker of agitation. They found none. Maya sat upright, gaze fixed on the speaker. No smile, no frown. Just silence that forced him to look back at his notes sooner than he'd meant to. Her lawyer pressed on. Slower now, each word weighted like a deliberate chess move. The interruptions kept coming, but Maya noticed their voices had quickened, their earlier ease slipping. What they didn't realize was that each time they broke in, they revealed something. A shift in tone, a tightened grip on a pen, a glance away at the wrong moment. Maya logged them all. The hearing ended without a decision, but as she rose from her seat, Maya already knew she didn't need to win today. This was only the overture, and she was more than willing to let them feel confident a little longer. In long games, the ones who celebrate early are the first to stumble. When it was over, the scrape of chairs echoed across the courtroom. The board's attorneys huddled instantly, whispering with a speed that betrayed urgency. A few glanced her way as if gauging whether the morning had rattled her. Maya didn't rush to pack up. She stacked her papers neatly, unhurried, before standing. Her eyes found the young lawyer who'd called her argument emotional. This time she smiled, not warmly, but with the faint curve of someone who had just spotted a flaw invisible to its owner. All morning, she had absorbed their interruptions without reaction, but she had memorized every tell. The faster speech over weak points, the knuckles whitening around a pen, the evasive eyes under direct questioning. To outsiders, these details meant nothing. To Maya, they were a map to the opposition's vulnerabilities. Outside, under the cold white light of the corridor, a reporter thrust a microphone forward. Do you think you'll win this case? Maya paused half a second, met the camera lens. I think, she said evenly, that the loudest laugh isn't always the winning one. Then she moved on, leaving behind the flurry of shutters and half-formed follow-ups. A strong wind swept past the courthouse steps, sending morning papers tumbling. Maya glanced at them, thinking of her opponent's bold declarations. They believed she was cornered. They didn't see that her silence was a deliberate space, one they would step into themselves. In this game, the first reaction was rarely the most important. Sometimes letting the other side talk longer, act more, was the surest way to make them contradict themselves, expose themselves, and unravel their own position. Maya knew that for those accustomed to constant attack, a prolonged quiet was unbearable. And in that quiet, she would set the bait. They didn't yet understand. Silence in the right hands could be the sweetest trap of all. That morning, the courthouse felt like a stage whose seats had been claimed hours before the curtain rose. The hallway was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters, cameras standing in tight formation, lenses glinting under the harsh fluorescence. When the courtroom doors swung open, the crowd surged inside, jostling for a spot with a clear view of the witness stand. The air inside was dense, the scent of fresh ink on legal briefs mixing with rushed coffee and the faint electronic hum of dozens of laptops in use. Every seat in the press section was occupied, bodies leaning forward, fingers tapping out a ceaseless patter on keyboards, the sound like rain ticking against a tin roof. At the plaintiff's table, Maya sat motionless, her back straight, hands resting lightly atop a folder. She wore a dark dress, no flashy jewelry, not to disappear into the background, but so every ounce of attention would rest on what she and her team were about to lay before the court. Across the aisle, the board's bench looked like a football lineup walking into a championship game. Leading them was their head counsel, tall, hair neatly parted, navy suit tailored to precision. When he stood, he didn't glance at a single page. His voice landed with the weight of a gavel. No violations, no evidence. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to derail a lawfully approved transaction. He spoke as though the verdict were already written, as though the court was merely indulging in a procedural formality before siding with him. His arguments rolled out with crafted ease, punctuated by clauses, figures, and declarations framed as undeniable. Occasionally he'd pause, casting a deliberate glance at the reporters, ensuring his words would land in tomorrow's headlines. Maya listened without a flicker of change in her gaze. She knew this wasn't just an address to the judge, and it was the opening act of a media play. They were running two chess games at once and believed they were winning both. He ended with a crisp final blow. This case has no legal basis and should be dismissed today. His table nodded in sync. Some exchanged smug glances. The tapping in the press section quickened, capturing every last phrase. Maya tilted her head slightly as if filing away the entire performance. She felt no rush to counter, because when an opponent is convinced they've already won, they never see the move that flips the board. And in Maya's mind, the decisive piece was still untouched. Her attorney, lean, sharp-eyed, carrying the quiet readiness of a hidden blade, rose without haste. No scraping chair, no showy shuffle. He simply set his pen down and stepped into the center of the room. "Your Honor," he began, his voice low but unmissable. "Before diving into the legal arguments, we wish to present a document that has been overlooked, or perhaps intentionally ignored, since this case began." From his case, he withdrew a slim folder encased in clear plastic. Just paper, but he held it like an ace in a high-stakes hand. "This," he said, "is the shareholder agreement signed 4 years ago, bearing all relevant signatures. And within this agreement..." He paused, letting eyes swing toward him. "Ms. Maya Sinclair is recognized as the largest individual shareholder with superior rights, including the right to veto any proposed merger." The room rippled. Whispered reactions spread like a wind skimming dry grass. Several reporters jerked upright, fingers hammering faster. The flash of cameras strobed against the judge's polished bench. Across the aisle, faces shifted. The lead counsel, once composed, leaned toward a colleague, whispering rapid fire. Another board member who'd sat with arms folded now flipped through his binder, searching for something long missed. Maya watched every flicker, every exchanged glance like a theater-goer who knows the script but still savors the improvisation when a prop falls unexpectedly. Her lawyer pressed on. With this right, Mrs. Sinclair is not merely entitled to a vote. She may unilaterally block the merger the defendants are attempting to complete. He drew out the words unilaterally block, like stamping them in red ink before the entire room. The atmosphere shifted at once. The board's earlier confidence was tinged now with unease. Their whispers sped up, eyes darting to the judge for rescue. Maya leaned forward slightly, palms resting on the table. Light from the window caught her face, revealing the faintest curve of a smile. Not triumph, but a reminder. This was only the beginning. In that instant, the entire room knew. The game had turned. The seconds after the folder hit the table were filled with a silence of a rare kind. Not the orderly quiet of courtroom protocol, but the pause of people recalculating the entire map in their heads. The board's table looked momentarily unseated. A member known for his composure adjusted his tie twice in quick succession. A tiny tick that didn't escape Maya's notice. The head counsel, who'd just been speaking as if victory were preordained, now leaned in, flipping pages with a speed that betrayed urgency. His eyes said what his words hadn't. There was no easy rebuttal. Further back, a younger director whispered to a neighbor. Maya caught just enough to know they hadn't even been aware the clause existed. Their panic was more than the loss of leverage. It was the realization they'd never had full control to begin with. Her attorney stepped back, letting the documents wait do the work. The press section's typing hadn't stopped, but the focus had shifted. Now, every detail was about the special shareholder clause. Maya sat tall, still silent, letting them feel each second as a tightening rope. Her eyes moved across their faces. Some tried to maintain composure, others tapped a hidden rhythm on their knees or clenched their hands. The same question would follow them out of the courtroom and into their calls, their emails marked urgent, even into restless naps on red-eye flights. What will she do next? On the table, the veto agreement lay like a queen moved from the corner into the center of the board, poised to strike but not yet in motion. Maya slowly closed her notebook, lifted her gaze, and locked eyes with the board's lead counsel. No smile, no nod. Just a look that said clearly, "We're not finished." Because once the queen is in play, every direction becomes a possible checkmate. No one in the courtroom spoke a word. Even the clacking of keys from the press row halted, as if everyone simultaneously understood this was a moment not to miss. The air was so taut that each breath felt loud. The judge sat motionless, his gaze sharp as it swept across both sides. Members of the board straightened in their seats, trying to mask their tension, but only making their posture look stiff and unnatural. A few gripped their pens as if clutching life rafts in a swift current. Maya didn't rush. She sat there, one hand resting lightly on the table, her eyes slowly scanning each face. With her other hand, she reached into her case and drew out a thin file. The faint shuffle of paper was clear enough for anyone to hear, and to recognize this was no ordinary folder. She pulled out a single sheet and laid it flat in front of her. Immediately, a few necks on the board's side craned, trying to read it from a distance. The judge's brows lifted, his gaze pausing on the bold title at the top. Maya picked up her pen. No explanation, no warning. Just the sound of the nib gliding across paper, crisp, decisive, clean. Every pair of eyes followed the movement, as if each stroke were a blade slicing through the map of power in this room. In the press row, a reporter whispered, "What did she just sign?" The colleague beside them answered quietly, though the whisper still carried in the stillness. "I don't know, but it's definitely something they didn't want her to." When Maya set the pen down, she didn't look up right away. Instead, she let her hand rest on the paper, stretching the moment so everyone could feel the weight of what had just happened. On the board's side, one person shifted uncomfortably, crossing and uncrossing their legs. Another leaned toward a colleague, lips moving with a question that went unanswered. Maya lifted her head. She didn't focus on any one person, yet somehow each felt as if she were looking straight at them. She slid the paper toward her attorney. The quiet rasp of it over the polished wood table seemed to travel farther than it should, marking the start of something no one could yet predict. And in that moment, everyone knew what she had just signed wouldn't end here. Her attorney took the sheet, rose, and handed it to the court clerk. Seconds later, a copy reached the judge's bench. His expression shifted slightly at the all-caps heading, then moved quickly through the clauses. It was a surprisingly brief document, under 2 pages. But in the world of shareholders and power, it weighed more than a mountain of contracts. It was the special clause signed 4 years earlier, granting Maya absolute veto over any merger. No conditions, no exceptions. The judge looked up, his voice measured and clear. Under this clause, the contested merger is hereby canceled, effective immediately. The words fell into the room like a stone dropped into a still pond. Ripples reached from the bench to the board's row. A few shook their heads as if refusing to believe their ears. One turned to a colleague, mouthing, "No way!" But the sound was nothing less than a confession. In the press section, hands that had been poised for the next legal argument now scrambled over keyboards to capture the moment. Camera flashes stuttered in quick bursts, catching Maya seated in calm composure, her expression as steady as if this were just another meeting. Then she stood. Not quickly, not noisily, but in a way that drew every gaze back to her. She took a single step forward, her voice low but carrying to every corner. 3 months of fighting. Lost to a piece of paper I signed years ago. No one replied. Not because they had no rebuttal, but because they knew any words now would only make that sentence echo louder. The simplicity was its blade, cutting clean through every defense. Some faces flushed, anger or shame or both. The board's lead counsel gripped his pen so hard his knuckles whitened. He turned toward his team, but no one spoke. Maya returned to her seat at the same steady pace. She knew they would scramble for a counter, but the veto clause left no gap to exploit. This wasn't just a legal win. It was a direct strike at their belief they could edge her out with boardroom maneuvering. When she sat, her gaze stayed on them. Not to gloat, but to remind them this ended not because she was stronger, but because they had underestimated what she held. And if one piece of paper could drop them, she knew she had far more for the next round. A strange hush hung in the air after the judge's ruling. No applause, no cheers, yet everyone knew they'd witnessed a moment that would be retold for years. Even veteran court reporters sat still for a beat, as if committing to memory how a single surgical strike could topple an entire plan. But those who knew Maya Sinclair understood. This wasn't the end. This was just a round where she'd forced the other side to fold early, conserving her strength for what was still to come. And that, everyone guessed, would be far more brutal. Across the board's table, composure slowly returned. Glances passed between them, silent messages clear. They weren't stopping here. Too much had been invested in taking Maya down to quit over a single legal blow, no matter how sharp it cut. Maya felt it too. She didn't linger after the adjournment. When she rose, the overhead lights caught the clean lines of her suit. A whisper from the air vent stirred the hem of her jacket. A detail so small it could have been chance, but made her look as though she were stepping out of a frame deliberately composed. She said nothing more. She didn't look back. She didn't need a final line. Her silence carried the weight of a promise. This was just one stop along the way, and the next moves wouldn't be so easy to read. In the gallery, some leaned to exchange guesses about her next step. Their eyes held not only respect, but a thread of unease. If this was just the opening, what would the climax look like? Passing the press row, Maya didn't dodge the cameras. She let them shoot, knowing those images would dominate front pages the next morning. And she didn't care about framing or lighting about it because every photo would tell the same story. A woman who had just flipped a board everyone thought was fixed. The courtroom door shut behind her, but its echo seemed to hang in the air, leaving the taste of unfinished business. Maya walked down the hall, her stride steady. Each step was a statement. If they wanted to keep fighting, she was ready. And somewhere, in the silence of those footsteps, was the unspoken promise of the next battle. The heavy wooden courtroom doors swung open, and Maya stepped out. Afternoon light slid over her shoulders, stretching her shadow across the worn stone steps. The sun had dipped low, casting a gold laced with amber, a thin filter that made everything look both warm and sharp. Below the steps, the press was ready. Cameras rose, lenses locked, flashes flaring in rapid bursts like a rain of light. Reporters jostled, thrusting black, silver, blue, and red microphones toward her like a wall of spears. Voices overlapped in a chaotic chorus, questions tumbling over one another so fast it was impossible to tell who had asked what. "Miss Sinclair, how do you feel right now? What do you think the board will do next? Is this your final victory?" Maya stood still at the top step, eyes sweeping the crowd. She didn't flinch, didn't rush to answer. Her sleek black hair lifted slightly in the breeze, and the dark lines of her tailored jacket remained perfect despite the long day in court. In front of her, faces brimmed with anticipation for the words that could become tomorrow's headline. They didn't just want information, they wanted a story. And more than that, they wanted emotion. Maya knew that. She'd seen it 100 times, and she'd learned to use that hunger to shape how her story would be told beyond these walls. A camera in the front row panned from her face down to her hand, loosely holding her leather case. It looked like a casual gesture, but it carried the impression that she was guarding something more important than words. The crowd seemed to lean in. Beyond the press pack, a few passers-by had stopped to watch. They didn't know the full story, but the intensity in Maya's gaze was enough to keep them silent. The last light of day sharpened her profile into something like an unedited portrait. She glanced briefly at the forest of microphones pointed her way, then drew in a slow breath. The air smelled faintly of exhaust, fresh ink from newspapers, and the powdery scent of makeup from those pressed closest to her. Maya knew this moment wasn't just the end of a trial, it was the start of something else. A door opening, not just for her, but for anyone watching, who realized that real power didn't always sit with the loudest voices. And all it would take was for her to step off these stairs for the story to move forward on her terms. The noise swelled. Questions grew sharper, faster, launched from every direction like arrows seeking a chink in her armor. Will you remain as CEO? Will the board be replaced? Are you going to sue again? How do you think they'll retaliate? Every question carried the scent of a hunt, as if they wanted to drag her into the center of the ring and make her feed them a front-page quote. Maya moved forward, the click of her heels against stone marking a steady rhythm, like a beat in a song only she knew. Her eyes stayed locked on the black car parked across the street, never once glancing back. Reporters followed. A microphone nearly brushed her shoulder. Camera flashes painted her shadow on the old brick wall behind. The pressure, the glare, the crush. Once she might have dreaded it. Now it was just a noisy backdrop that made her silence stand out all the more. It wasn't an empty silence. It was weighty enough to make the questions falter, dropping into the space between without an answer. And slowly that silence began to unsettle them. A young reporter at the back whispered, "What if she's already planned it all?" She kept moving. A mic brushed her jacket, leaving a faint gleam on the smooth fabric. Maya didn't break stride, didn't react, but her eyes fixed ahead still caught everything in her periphery. Who wanted a headline, and who was only here to see if she'd stumble. With 3 steps left, a male voice rang out from the front, clearer and louder than the rest. "Miss Sinclair, is this the end or the beginning?" Maya paused for half a second. She didn't turn, didn't search for the face behind the question. She simply stopped long enough for the crowd to hold its breath, then kept walking, as if the question hadn't been worth answering. The black car door opened. Light from inside fell across her face, catching the faint upward curve of her lips. Not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like a message. "You'll find out soon enough." The door shut, sealing off the noise outside. The crowd lingered, unsure whether the real headline was the question left hanging, or the fact that she'd just turned the silence into the loudest answer of the day. And in that silence, everyone understood the real door had only just opened. The car rolled away from the courthouse steps, melting into the city's evening flow. Outside, the press stayed rooted, some trading looks of disappointment and confusion. They'd come for an explosive statement, but instead they'd been handed a void that knew exactly how to linger in their minds. Inside the car, Maya leaned back, eyes on the passing buildings. The last sunlight flickered across the glass, alternating bands of shadow and gold across her face. No one in the car spoke. Even the driver seemed to sense her focus and kept quiet. In her mind, the afternoon replayed like film. The board's smug faces in the courtroom, the shock when the shareholder agreement emerged, and the drawn-out silence before the judge's ruling. But she didn't let herself bask in the win. She knew the people sitting across from her today wouldn't be gone tomorrow. They'd regroup, and their counterstrike could be sharper. Her phone buzzed. Maya glanced at the message from her lawyer. Today was a win, but we need to prepare for the next step. There will be pushback. Her lips lifted slightly, this time into a clear smile, like one that belonged to someone who understood the game. Of course, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Outside, the car turned onto a quieter street. Maya tapped her fingers lightly on the seat's edge, a steady beat that matched the moves forming in her mind. She could already see the pieces on the board, the moves her opponents wouldn't notice until it was too late. A courtroom win wasn't the finale. It was just the ticket to a bigger fight. One where money, power, and relationships once thought untouchable would be tested to their core. When the car slowed in front of her office building, Maya drew in a deep breath. The air outside smelled faintly of smoke. The city's noise returned, but now it was only background to a sharply defined goal. She stepped out, the last light of the day touching her shoulder, just as it had when she left the courthouse. But this time, her steps weren't leaving a battle behind. They were carrying her straight into a new war. Because sometimes a victory is nothing more than a ticket into a far greater fight. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.